It's gonna have like a pre-recorded intro that you did.
That fungi emerge as a response to light striking the earth. Now, we understand that mushrooms exist to release spores into the environment. But why some produce psilocybin? As yet, it should be explained. I've been fascinated by psychoactive drugs my whole life. I love to study the chemistry that impact on society, and my work has allowed me to investigate extraordinary substances around the world. Yet there are still mysteries that remain. For hundreds of years. Now, their fruits are ready to be seen. This is the story of psilocybin containing mushrooms. I've been hoping to interview a clandestine mushroom grower for months, but expected them to be a secret and a trusted. I knew I had to use advanced investigatory tactics to infiltrate their inner circle.
What do you are, Mister?
So
Is that how you infiltrated it?
Where you possess the skills and experience to tell me about the inner workings of the underground mushroom trade. A few months later, I was on to meet them, eye to eye. Patient was not on camera because it houses one of the largest clandestine mushroom growers in North America. This grow room is capable of producing tens of pounds of mushrooms every week. Very nice. You want to tell me about all these what's going on right now? What am I looking at?
What is just one straight food teacher right now.
Final teacher.
He's going to certain people and stuff like that. They're really not nice for stuff.
What is it?
Very nice.
How high?
Well, we can sell them as fast as we do.
Since the beginning of clandestine cultivation, virtually all growers have favored the same species, Psilocybe cubensis. It's not the largest or the most potent, but it's highly adaptable to the needs of humans who control its artificial propagation. After decades of genetic manipulation, these strains won't survive in nature without the human hand, and humans couldn't have bred them without the guiding hand of nature.
Yeah, so research wants to try on that.
Seems very friendly to me, but I guess this is also a somewhat sketchy thing.
It's not illegal. That's what really nice.
Like a room where a surgical procedure is performed, a mushroom grow chamber must be almost completely sterile as possible. Because any contamination that enters these bins could destroy the entire crop. This crop represents months of work, years of research, and thousands of dollars. Oh wow.
Sometimes hands will be over mushrooms in a day, 2 days.
Just about the opposite. Sky's identity says a lot about this sort of work where you pick up a lot of surrounding mushrooms.
Most people that do make those laws, they've never tried these things. They're probably this person has. Always informed.
Can you tell me a little bit about how this sort of work differs from other realms in the drug dealing world?
Well, I'd say it's a lot safer, that's for sure. Being not dealer and heroin dealer, you definitely be susceptible to a lot of damage to the spirit, really. mushrooms are pretty common. People don't really have like panels or lures, or it's not really as contested over as
It's more peaceful. Have you heard anything about the way people use this mushrooms in Mexico?
Which of those things are those?
I don't even know about them.
I don't know much.
Have you heard about Maria Sabina? She's a foreign mushroom shamanist who's considered responsible for introducing social international abundance of psilocybin fungi. It's hard to imagine that near 60 years ago, their existence was only known to a small number of indigenous healers. But that was changed by the work of Aztec shaman Maria Sabina. Hola, me llamo Hamilton. Estoy en Guadalajara de Jiménez, una ciudad muy famosa por los juegos clásicos. Eso, señora. ¿Usted sabe mi casa de María Sabina? Sí.
I think I've seen this when he goes around Mexico looking for this mushroom shaman woman. Supposedly started all of this.
Hola. Eso, señora. ¿Usted sabe dónde queda la casa de María Sabina? Gracias. Vamos a la casa de María Sabina. Oaxaca is one of the poorest states in Mexico, and these indigenous regions are especially poor. They are high mountains, and it's certainly not convenient in terms of accessing the rest of the world. So it's an unlikely place to be a development, and they have internet, there's hot water, and electricity, and most of that thanks to Maria Sabina. Maria Sabina was a locally renowned shaman who used mushrooms ceremonially for spiritual and diagnostic purposes. But she became world famous when she introduced her mushrooms to a bakery in Boston and wrote a widely read article about the mushrooms in 1957. This led to the Western world's first exposure to the concept of magic mushrooms. Countercultural celebrities like John Lennon, Bob Dylan, Janis Joplin, and to a lesser extent Pele are reported to have made pilgrimages to Huautla to experience one of Maria Sabina's famous mushroom ceremonies. As a result, Huautla de Jimenez became the most populous and prosperous town in the Sierra Mazateca. At the home of Maria Sabina, I met with her grandson.
This one I didn't make it like a round marble. It's more like a football shape, and it's like a pot, like it's like pot or something sitting next to it instead.
Kind of looks like a pineapple.
Or a pineapple. I think it looks more like a vessel type shape.
Se você injectou
But now I understand that no one in Huautla is collecting their own mushrooms.
Seems like this guy knew, because he said the wild ones are more sacred. He's like, people have to ask the land first because it's the heart of the land. And remember in that fungi documentary, they're talking about how like those things communicate and like things symbiotically like evolved alongside the mycelium. And, like gave it access to nutrients and could put them in.
And they're underground, just wait, they're already there.
Right, exactly.
It's in that whatever that some of those guys were selling, they were like the like roots of it or whatever.
Right.
I forget the heck they were talking about.
Oh, like the truffles.
The truffle clumps, yeah. They kind of had like a spiritual idea of what scientifically what people are proving now.
Right, exactly.
They kind of knew, and how did they know? They were just coming up with those ideas.
Because they know they say the land told them, you know what I'm saying?
They were with their equipment, they're communicating with the land and the
Right.
trees too. With their instruments.
Ethiopia, with the hopes of observing Martian ceremony, but in the height of dry season, crucial maintenance was missing. While it is unusual city in space for mushrooms, people come here to undergo traditional mushroom ceremonies and buy mushrooms, but it's not a place people go to hunt for mushrooms. The spots where mushrooms grow are very secret. They're places that the shamans don't necessarily even know about themselves. There are a small number of people in this community that go out into the mountains and collect mushrooms. They don't tell anyone where they find them because it's forbidden. There are 3 species of mushrooms recognized by the Aztec shaman: San Pedro, or Psilocybe cubensis; Pajaritos, or Psilocybe mexicana; and Nutmeg, which can be either Psilocybe pubescens or Psilocybe zamaticorum. But finding the one has proven to be difficult. I met with a local mushroom enthusiast outside my hotel. He told me he didn't know where they grew, but suggested I talk to an artist who uses mushrooms to inspire his paintings. Congo and the artist showed me his work, but also didn't know where they grew, and told me to talk to his friend Jose, who composes mushroom-inspired music. Jose played me a few of his songs, but said he hadn't seen fresh mushrooms for months. I mentioned a friend named Charlie, who had been great. Charlie had been indulging in tea spirits. He assured me that if we have trouble finding mushrooms for a ceremony, and offered me the phone number of a local newspaper for artists. I texted Toronto. He responded to the photo that he gave lessons of unspeakable illness. And so the hunt began. The next day I met with Toronto to discuss his tantalizing cave lessons photo. He told me of a private mountaintop garden where the mushrooms grow. Maria said he was great grandmother. He traveled as I was, so he tagged along.
El aguamiento de la caña, y de la caña sale después el bagazo de encendida, y entonces ahí brota ese niño que ayer les mostré. Es la gran caminata para sacar todo lo malo que hay dentro del cuerpo. Es colesterol, cualquier cosa. El cigarro quizás de todo. Hola, señor.
At the top of the mountain, we arrived at the home of a man named Malvo, who cultivated mushrooms in a fenced-off garden, fertilized with sugarcane pulp. Oh, wow, and actually hundreds of Psilocybe cubensis, the largest I've ever seen. They're just in the textbook. Psilocybe cubensis. I brought them half of the organs to different colors there. They are absolutely amazing. They're very potent.
We just got up like piles of the mushrooms just growing up or drying on the roof of the shack. Right?
有那个臭了，就吐血经验，也吐血。
Why are these mushrooms so large?
所以就是特别要这个的还，就是用这个还是。你听说那种有那种是，就是要看我们不现在那种痛，就是要痛的话，因为那个是偏嘛，我是说，那个那时候是也是有的，这用的，这这个是要比较就，人家这块就是啥东西，那东西就是啥东西嘛，有东西complet, complet en France. Bon, les guides, c'est des détails. Comment?
Okay.
Okay.
That's nice. Can you cross it?
Así es. El tamaño del tío. El 30 feliz y el final. Como dice la vida. Pero no, darle abajo.
Gracias. Oh, wow. A lot of dry mushrooms. You are able to dry these mushrooms. 10 ounces of dried close to really is a magical garden that you have. Unbelievable. Are these all from this season? This is a process. It goes on. Now you see probably 100 dry mushrooms over here on this altar with the facial Jesus. And here there are thousands more.
The music's pretty funny. Look at all these mushrooms!
I'm encouraging you to eat the mushrooms outside of a medical or ceremonial context. What do you think of that?
我们在家，一些大人们理解听，大人也是家里也是这样，但他都是那个骗，但他不是那个钱的。
And that's an eternal thing. I do it silently in my head.
也是也浪费时间了，他不能把书，也就是也得找一个位置。
So I'm starting to trip from the mushrooms that your friend gave me. What do you think I should do?
不错，我以前就是应该点点，这巧的点也不一样，这是应该也不一样。
Alright. Very beautiful. Far from the city center of Guatemala, Amalro lived in relative isolation. He spoke no Spanish and truly believed mushrooms are sacred. They should never be exchanged for money. All these mushrooms are just picked in the garden. They're amazing. As with party here, he insisted on taking a bag of fresh psilocybin lessons from his garden for ceremonial use. People that love mushrooms, mycophiles, have their own rituals and traditions when they hunt for mushrooms. One of them is taking spore prints, which aids identification, but also allows someone to save the spores of the mushroom, which is the entire biological purpose of the mushroom exists. It allows you to propagate the mushroom, it allows you to verify the identity of the species, and it's one of the only ways of preserving something that otherwise begins to deteriorate very quickly. Footprints have been used to identify mushrooms for almost 200 years. But not everyone is using spores for taxonomic analysis. Fungi can produce by releasing spores into the environment, like seeds The spores germinate once they found a suitable substrate, but unlike seeds, they're haploid and require the genetic material from another spore to produce a dikaryotic fungus capable of sexual reproduction. A single mushroom can release tens of thousands of them in environment.
Okay, here's some spores.
Agar uses gelatinous growth substrate with only seaweed as a widely used for isolating pure cultures. In nature, fungi can live in harmony with other organisms, but when isolated from their natural environment and placed on high-nutrient media, the presence of unique microorganisms creates a fierce battle between the desired fungus and a diverse ecology of contaminants.
Most of the stuff that I've read is just general information on the internet, done experiments with other things, the variables, and can put them up in the works. It's great, it's pretty,
Several friends.
it's not hard.
Whenever anyone collects mushroom spores in the wild, they can be used for this sort of a process to inoculate either agar or even grain that it can select a strain and transfer it into a suitable growth substrate.
These are from nature, so it's pretty hard to tell how they're going to be or any of that. Their own and secret sauce on.
After an agar wedge is removed, it has been used to inoculate a jar of sterilized grain. The jar is ready to spend the next month in a dark room where it begins to colonize. The mycelium is a dense web of microscopic fibers that can be seen by the naked eye as it engulfs and consumes its substrate.
Oh wow, this is huge.
This is where the foundation of magic happens. So when helium is going from one grade to another, it's out of order. It looks beautiful, you know, it looks
Sharps aren't here.
down here, that amounts to me about 8 lactose. After we call them treasure.
There's another type of lifeline here not for cultivation, but for the thrill of discovering new species in the wild.
Oh, wow, look at that. That's a beautiful berry. This is unreal. It's actually back out here. Oh, wow. That is not too many times.
Amazing. First I've ever seen.
Alan Rockefeller has studied the distribution of psilocybin in Mexico for more than a decade.
There's a really cool zoo out here. I mean, this is actually like a dome. That would be perfect. Like it's an edible. But
And it is scary.
I think that is.
These species of Mexican bioluminescent sexual sapphire.
This is something I've never seen before.
Holy moly. That's insane. That part of the fungus?
Yeah.
What? What is this?
I don't know.
It's not bad for this giant pangolin cluster pseudofistril.
Alan travels each year from his home in Oakland to Mexico, where he spends months photographing and discovering new species of fungi.
It's very neat like that. And clouds come in around 3 p.m. every day, and the whole place goes up and fog. And it makes it really interesting, a different place for plants and mushrooms too.
How did you find this location?
I spent a long time looking for it. We drive around the different cloud forests of Mexico. Whenever you see a landslide, you check the bottom of the landslide near the river. It's a place we're going in is over here.
Where did the interest or the obsession with mushrooms begin?
I was walking in the forest on a hike, and there was mushrooms everywhere. And I wanted to learn which ones were poisonous, which ones were edible, which ones were rare, which ones were psychoactive. And so I just started taking pictures of them and bringing them home to explore brains and study. We went to college to get in there. I've written a lot of Wikipedia articles and edited a lot of Wikipedia articles. And I like to take really nice pictures of mushrooms and put them into Wikipedia.
Were we interested in psychedelic mushrooms before any of this?
I was interested in the psychedelic ones, but it's not really my favorite thing, and the edibles are not really my focus. My focus is really cool, rare stuff. Species that people have never discovered before. Just really interesting, unusual, beautiful looking mushrooms. You know, we were in Mexico in about 4 months. They were camping out every night, hunting mushrooms all day, and doing microscope work in the evenings around campfire. They're just glorious. They really are. It's probably the most beautiful philosophy in the world. This is the best spot I found in all of Mexico. Flaco stem is really distinct in Ecuador. The bell rings around the Palos Margin, around spore prints, are all over the caps that are adjacent, and there's a cool spore print on the stem. You can see group losing right there. You can see this Apis is almost the only mushroom that grows here. And it's not a coincidence. They really like these landslide areas, but not a very fresh landslide. They're like landslides that are a few years old.
It's one of the largest, one of the most beautiful, one of the most potent psilocybin-containing mushroom species, and I've never seen it in nature before. It's truly a glorious thing to behold. This is one of the original ones that was used by the Aztecs, right?
Yeah, and the Zapotecos, named after the Zapotecos. And it's pretty hard to find.
In Mexico, the use of psilocybin-containing mushrooms was traced back to ancient civilizations like the Aztec Empire, where they were consumed in conjunction with ritualistic suicide and human sacrifice. At the University of Guadalajara's Ontario, I met with mycologist Laura Guzman, daughter of the legendary Gaston Guzman, the leading expert on taxonomy in the genus Psilocybe.
Mi papá era uno de los que identificó el hongo que representan en una cueva en España como Psilocybe hispanica, una especie alucinógena, y que entonces se pensaría que a lo mejor bajo la influencia de los efectos de ese hongo tuvieron visiones que ellos plasmaron en las cuevas. En una pintura, en inglés y francés, una manita muscaria. Entonces piensan que tanto Adán y Eva lo que están ahí consumiendo no es la manzana de ese árbol, sino es el hongo alucinógeno que le hizo tener esas experiencias espirituales, y de ahí el surgimiento de la religión. This also is a hallucination. This was discovered many years ago.
Thanks, everybody.
Wow.
Uno de los proyectos que tenía con mi papá y que ahora voy a desarrollar yo sola es el de establecer el origen de Psilocybe cubensis. Psilocybe cubensis crece en un estiércol de ganado, entonces no puede ser una especie de Latinoamérica, que haber sido traído probablemente de África o de Asia. Primero se introdujo a por eso un ecólogo norteamericano que lo hay y produjo Psilocybe cubensis.
The discovery that Psilocybe cubensis in the United States produced the same effect as the San Isidro of Mexico, sent a new generation of microbiomes onto private
We've got two packages. They see each other, right? They're pretty much at the end. And I was going at the guy, look out, and Bill's fashion, this guy walking around with the I let him get him up in here and that ditch, something like this. What are you doing? I had that rifle. That poor boy is scared me so bad. Oh my God. And I said, how'd you get in here? He said, I walked across the road. I said, get back across that road and don't go over here again.
Conservative farm owners were dismayed to find the dump of their cattle was the preferred substrate for a mind-altering drug.
Why do small people on your land take money?
Because it's a liability. They go in there, get hurt, turn around and sue. And I think it's a stupid thing to do. I don't use drugs and I don't, they get money else. I think it's a drag on society and get these people that are addicted and, all they want to do is lay around, do down drugs and stuff over and collect welfare. So,
For mushrooms?
I don't know what it is. Maybe you saw them mushrooms and then you go to marijuana and next thing you're gonna crack or, I don't know. Maybe it's an entry drug, Do something. Don't deal with it.
Something that guy doesn't have no idea what he's talking about.
They do with it instead of going to work, Too many good things to do in life besides that.
Without a history of shamanism or training in identification, the mushroom makers in Florida have still forged a relationship with the fungus.
The state of Florida, we could go all year round, but it depends on the rain season and on the winter. From here doesn't really much, they all year round from January to April.
Have you been obsessed with mushrooms?
As you say, kind of one day, I don't really know exactly how to put it, but just, anytime you go to face one, guys in China, see the whole, usually say the trip was about, after that, more of my friends started talking to me about mushroom taking and stuff like that, so, got me, looking at that really well. After that, it was more spiritual than it was, medicinal use, just to get high from mushrooms, but instead, people to seek more knowledge, and to get some power. I'm sorry, I don't know if there's a lot of people, so. Would be proud of it, but start going on to. Most of my things with muscles that I talk about is all based on theory and experience. It's all about research. But glad I didn't drop out. Exciting.
Sweating up a storm, slowly walking through this cow pasture, inspecting cow dung for the presence of psilocybin cubensis.
Where was white ones? And here's like gold and top one with good view.
It's really gorgeous one. Nice, elegant, fully open tap. We have another mushroom growing above it. There's also a ring of purple around the origin. Big classic textbook, psilocybin cubensis. This feels nothing but psilocybin cubensis. Florida, psilocybin cubensis.
I never understood how people have bad trips on mushrooms because the overwhelming joy that I feel every time I do them. It's weird because it's not like ecstasy where it just like pumps you full of happiness and then you come down and you're sad. It's like a lasting peace.
There's a vehicle coming down this track. I think sounds like an excavator.
I recovered my non-psychoactive Peniel Phantalarium and returned to the hunt.
Do any of these mushrooms with your family? Would you like to try?
Yes, definitely. Definitely. That'd be awesome. It'd be an awesome experience just to get going and see how they react on them, see how they maybe inform me while under the influence of psilocybin. Or maybe some words of wisdom that they possibly give me would be pretty cool to see what they, you know what I mean? You might be more philosophical.
Exactly.
while most Americans wouldn't consider the psychedelic experience something to be shared with family, amongst the shamans of Ratluck, it would be unnatural to do it any other way.
제가 평소에 주의를 하나씩 기도했었는데 제 지식이 수익과 수석이 밤에서 안에서 와이프에 대한 힘이 있으면서 무엇이 거의 지식이 전사에 가서 와서 이야기 나를 유익시키기 좀 수양 인식이 어디서 해야 될 거야 힘이 나서 걔가 다 약간 간단해
Thank you, Maria Sabina, for allowing Gordon Lawson into your home. I think that hundreds of thousands and millions of people have benefited because of your generosity and ability to share information with outsiders, which is a good thing.
31 years after Maria Sabina's death, the use of psilocybin is being recognized by medical establishments for treatment of depression, cluster pain, OCD, and addiction. And as I head to a ceremony in Philadelphia, I remember that medicinal use in his family is where it all began. At the top of the hill overlooking mountain is Philadelphians preparing ceremony for his son, a struggling alcoholic. His wife was losing her eyesight, and me. I have mild psoriasis. The ceremony begins with Philadelphia collecting the mushrooms I gathered from the sugarcane garden with smoke from oolong incense that's been used as an offering to gods since the Aztec and Mayan empires.
Some of the places that he gets like tripped up just like freak me out. Right, like every time I get there and eat mushrooms, I'm like, fuck Mexico. What are you doing here?
It's probably still better than the Amazon.
Cartels come in here and kidnap me. Probably gotta pay off some local like that sometimes.
Oh man, he's got pockets full of it. He just stuff
Yeah. That's how he gets all these bills. He just dusts it.
He just dust up. He's like, pay me with leaves while I burn this stove.
Right? While I'm high on too. Like crazy. Serial kills somebody in every country he goes to. Like they're more scared of Hamilton than he is of them. Like this guy, you never know, he's a wizard.
Ese es el número uno, más fuerte del mundo, porque es uno de caña. Uno, dos, sí,
I thought it was nice. This sort of side values to bring many families together. Sure, there's families all over the planet that would benefit from this sort of ritual. Sitting in a nice chat, everybody burning
Yeah, the
incense
rain was probably
candlelight, and sitting together and talking about health problems and eating mushrooms, feeling better.
Copal is crazy too. It's a super high vibration resonance, and it's like you gotta have an incense burner for it. But if you try to put it on charcoal, it won't even touch the charcoal. It's like if you like flick some water in a hot skillet and kind of the light frost effect or whatever, how it doesn't really touch the skillet, it just like dances around on it. The copal just like turns straight to smoke.
And it has been all part of the human mushroom partnership in their own way. And when we become a society that can embrace the mushroom, then, and only then, can we embrace each other.
this little message at the end. You get my jaws down here?
last month was a little bit slow, but this month I have a lot of really interesting new projects to release. Interview with Ed Domino, the position of the first Student Academy to a human being, as well as Carl Hart, and several other things that have already recorded. But right now, I'm going to release a discussion with a pharmacologist at the University of Florida named Oliver Grundman, who conducted the largest creative consumer study thus far in 2017. He published numerous papers on Kratom, expert on the subject.
Kratom.
And so it's a discussion with him about his research, and I'm joined by Soren Shade, who's actually been on this podcast twice previously in past production updates because he was a producer on the third season of Pharmacopoeia. And the reason that Soren is coming to this discussion is because after Pharmacopoeia, he started a kratom tea company called Top Tree. And I personally am not a user of kratom, but I went to the lab where we're doing all the quality control and analysis on this product. They test for heavy metals, they do chemical analysis, it's ethically sourced, it's a good product if you use kratom. And another thing that I like about it is that instead of it being an extract or a powder capsule, it's a tea bag, and so it's a slightly different way of preparing kratom as a aqueous infusion, which is actually the way I first used it, and it was probably one of the rare, very positive experiences that I've had with the plant, with the strain of aqueous infusion. So it's a cool product. What I really like is that Soren and Dr. Grundman are collaborating on this survey to try to gather basic information about kratom. You know, it's kind of bizarre to think that you know so much about the chemistry and molecular neuropharmacology of kratom alkaloids, and very simple questions like, what's the average age of an American kratom user are more difficult to answer. So that's why these surveys are really important. It helps gather information. That way, if there is some kind of regulatory challenge, or the next time they attempt to prohibit it, you can point to peer-reviewed scientific literature and say, look, there are 2,000 people responded to the survey. They feel that it offers this or that benefit, or if negative things are reported, then the industry can, I hope, change the practices accordingly to try to mitigate some of those negative effects. So I think it's really good to do these surveys. I took the survey myself. It took me 10 minutes, easy. But what's really nice, especially when you consider the fact that this is a plant that's being used in countless different ways. You have extracts, you have plants from different geographical regions, you have different alkaloid concentrations, you have various alcohol infusions, you have, who knows, I mean, you also have these weird unregulated products that are adulterated with synthetic opioids. You have all sorts of different things. So one nice thing about the survey is that every person buys Top Tree gets a link to the survey, and a subcategory of respondents can specify where they got it. That way you can know precisely, at least for that subcategory of respondents, what percentages are having this or that positive or negative effect. So I think it's a good thing to do, and I definitely support this effort to gather basic knowledge about the plant. I'm also linking another survey, totally unrelated, that's being set up by Imperial College London on 5-MeO-DMT, and the idea that anyone who is planning on consuming 5-MeO-DMT to a synthetic material, I hope, or leucoal variant venom, I think you know how I feel about that, that you participate in the survey to gather more basic information about the utilization and things like that. I haven't taken that particular survey because it's not that you use synthetic products to result in the future, but you aren't. I don't think that is a description of the podcast. And yeah, I think this discussion is really interesting. We talk about all the different attributes and problems associated with kratom, including
Wait, he's not eating DMT anymore?
the correct pronunciation is
It's like a
No,
podcast.
he's saying basically, he's saying that he doesn't want people to use the toad because it's animal abuse when you can successfully synthesize it without needing to use the animal.
Answer some questions.
He's trying to end people like keeping these toads captive,
So,
torturing
Just to
them.
summarize, what if you're working on a new survey now?
People can grow, you know what I'm
Yes,
saying? Like that's
so
some of the
this is
shit that he
universe,
regrets that he openly talks
and
about.
it's
And now he's
yes,
trying to
we
change
actually
it, trying to do
working.
something, you know?
Completed the second survey, an international survey on Kratom users recently.
And it's more about in
recently
that setting, I
back to
feel like he might have also been trying to
2022.
respect their tradition
and,
of it, you know what I mean?
Prior to that, I completed.
Yeah, that was like-
He wanted to go for the experience, it wasn't about, you know,
So.
trying to like
hope to
convince some
see
tribes that
some
they're wrong, you
differences,
know?
in an international survey that also included.
But you've also seen how whenever they did that, then they let the toad go, you know, like some people will try to just keep the
The
toad.
thing came back. It jumped in the canoe itself.
Well, that's what it was, that was before, I'm saying afterwards, they went for that
And
contingency.
I don't think,
working on
wonder if that frog had been caught
particular
before.
survey.
Oh, definitely,
a new
probably,
survey,
yeah.
Particularly.
Who knows how many
associated
tribes are out there doing that?
Users that use a defined amount of kratom that is delivered in a tea form, in a tea bag form. So that allows for more of a dosing based form of kratom versus just loose powder or loose just kratom products that are not well defined.
And how are you distributing the survey?
It will be distributed online and anonymous, so folks will not be able to be identified, so they can feel comfortable in actually answering the questions in the format that they feel comfortable answering them. Sometimes also related to potentially using other drugs concomitantly with kratom or related to prior opioid use, because we know that some folks have been using kratom to mitigate opioid withdrawal symptoms, for example.
Right. And have you decided how the survey itself is actually going to be distributed, like what website it will be on, where it will be hosted?
So at the University of Florida, we use Qualtrics as a survey delivery platform, which has several layers of security, I would say, to also protect both the ones that answer the survey as well as adhere to institutional review board requirements, IRB requirements. So that is intended to protect both those who are taking the survey as well as maintain data integrity and data security. So that is where we will deliver the survey, and the distribution will be maintained through those who are actually selling the product.
Yeah. I think it's really valuable and interesting to do these sorts of surveys, but I always wonder what sort of biases they contain in terms of selecting for a more self-aware analytical user who would be interested in taking the survey in the first place or even thinks about their own use. Do you think that that there's some bias there in terms of the sorts of people that care enough about their use of kratom to report on it in some way?
Oh, yes, definitely. There's no question about that. And I think that is a limitation of these surveys. The issue at the moment is that we cannot conduct actual human trials on kratom in the United States because of the limitations that the FDA imposes on kratom. And we have not had a chance to get kratom trials approved in the United States, kratom human clinical trials in the United States. This is something that will probably happen in some years to come, but in the meantime, we are really getting a lot of information from current kratom users. It is selective, it is biased, there's no question about it. But what we have seen in collaboration with, for example, Kirsten Smith, who is currently a postdoc at NIDA, at the National Institutes on Drug Abuse, is that when we look at Reddit user forums, they are obviously less biased in their opinion
what they post, and they have done kind of crawling through some of that data on Kratom, and we are now publishing an article on how they report their experiences using Kratom, both for opioid withdrawal symptoms as well as some of their experiences with dependence development in regards to Kratom use, which has been reported in the literature as well. And that kind of aligns, actually, some of that overlaps with what we see with some of the surveys, as well as some unique experiences in terms of adverse effects and dependence development from Kratom use.
Right. And one thing that I made a short documentary about Kratom years ago, and one of the things that I experienced as a real problem reporting on it responsibly was disentangling the political dimensions from what was, basic toxicological or psychopharmacological problems. So you have people that are aware that we live in this country with a long history of prohibition. They are deriving some benefit from this plan, and they desperately don't want it to be prohibited. And so they're basically concocting a false narrative to only talk about the positive sides of the plant, because they're so afraid that if they acknowledge anything negative about it, that it will result in prohibition, and the medicine will be taken away from them. They say it's not a drug, it's not an opioid, it's not addictive, or whatever. And is that something that you thought about? Because I did notice that there's quite a bit of it's dishonesty, but I understand why they're being dishonest. It's this sort of realistic reflection of the legal environment that we live in, where there's serious costs attached to being honest about why you use certain psychoactive substances and what the real effect of those substances might be.
So definitely, I think that Kratom has its benefits and its detriments and its adverse effects. And we clearly see in some of these surveys, when users report how much Kratom they use per dose and with what frequency they use Kratom, that there is an increase. There's a dose-response relationship when it comes to adverse effects. And also a higher risk of dependence development to Kratom itself, with higher doses, with higher frequency of use. So it would be irresponsible for anybody who does research on Kratom to say that Kratom is just innocuous and let's just, pretend that nothing can happen if you use Kratom. So I think it is important to point out that Kratom labeling should be adhering to certain standards, that Kratom products that are out there should adhere to certain quality standards, that there should be certain requirements imposed on those who manufacture and sell Kratom products. With any drug that is available, no matter if it's a synthetic drug or if it's a natural product, there are benefits and adverse effects that are associated with its use. And I think we need to point that out and need to make people aware of it.
Yes, yeah, because you may have seen there's a subreddit called Quitting Kratom or Quitting Kratom, and it's filled with people who are just really bothered by the false narrative because they feel like they got sucked into this because everyone was saying that it wasn't a drug or it wasn't an opioid, it didn't have abuse potential, and they kind of got themselves into a problematic use pattern. And it's a very precarious position because you want to acknowledge all the good things about it, because especially in the realm of opioids, I think it's pretty clear that this is an extraordinary plant that has tremendous advantages over really anything else out there in terms of something that can be accessed by the common person. So it's a difficult balance.
Yeah, and I think anybody who self-treats an opioid use disorder or any substance use disorder runs the risk of developing, basically substituting one substance with another always runs the risk of developing a new dependence to that new substance. And therefore, I think it is important that such people seek the help of a professional that can assist them in that journey. If that is their trusted healthcare professional, or it is a clinic that can benefit them, I think it is important that they have somebody at their side that assists them through that journey. Just self-treatment, you run the risk of either substituting one substance for another, and therefore just, that's what we do basically with methadone, buprenorphine. We switch somebody from one substance to another within a legal setting. Now they are basically dependent on another substance in a legal setting, which is great, which is the first great step. And some folks then remain basically dependent on that drug for the rest of their life. I'm not arguing that we are that Quantum is the magical be all end all to the solutions for some of these people, and I think they need to seek help and should not rely on Quantum to solve their problems.
Right. Which I think is a very good lead into like why your survey is so important. Why I'm looking forward to it when it comes to tea preparation. Because I think a lot of the negative side effects or the toxicity that we've been talking about can be related to the formula or the preparation of the kratom and how it's being taken, and of course the dose and the extracts, and just seeing the use pattern that's around tea versus consuming powder at up to 20 grams a day, be able to isolate some of these factors a little bit better in terms of the prevalence of the withdrawal or the addictive aspects of it, the same way that you would likely see less withdrawal symptoms from a regular green tea drinker versus someone who's taking 600 milligrams of encapsulated caffeine every day. And I think these surveys are very important for pulling more data in regards to this aspect of how one consumes it.
Well, yeah, definitely. I think what is important here to note is if somebody basically drinks this powder that they make a slur out of, is that they are not getting like just a water extraction that you would get with a tea bag when you drink peppermint tea or when you drink green tea, or you mentioned, Soren. But you also get this slur, this kind of often, which is very bitter, by the way, so it's not very pleasant to drink at all. And that obviously contributes to a whole host of other issues that you potentially cannot predict very well what you actually ingest, contributing to an unpredictable nature overall of what you actually ingest and what is being absorbed by your body overall. Whereas with a water extraction, an infusion, which is a tea extraction, hot water extraction, you get a much more controlled absorption of and ingestion of what you actually ingest.
Yeah, no, I think it's unfortunate that there isn't more appreciation of things like that in our sort of folk understanding of the way drugs work. Because, probably the best example is cocaine, where I even made a short piece about a psychiatrist in Peru years ago who was doing psychosurgery on cocaine addicts, where he was removing part of the cingulate gyrus, and it was having sort of miraculous results, but then there was a outcry against it. And he said it's unethical, you can't perform psychosurgery on addicts, so he had to find a different way of treating cocaine addiction. And he found that just giving the cocaine addicts focus tea was as effective as singulotomy. So it's amazing how just changing the route of administration and changing the dosing frequency can have this profound therapeutic effect. And that's, of course, a big part of the rare instances of fatal overdoses as well. Like polydrug intoxication aside, it's certainly not people chewing fresh leaves and making a tea. It's people that are consuming enormous quantities of extracts or powder in some, I mean, the one that I was aware of was someone that was sort of molding the powder into a bar and then eating huge quantities of the raw powder and these like bars that he had made. Is that your interpretation of the instances of severe toxicity and fatal overdose?
So I have been involved a little bit in this on the sidelines, admittedly. But from what I have seen, the 46 plus fatal overdoses where mifegynan was reported in the postmortem blood of these unfortunate deaths. It was primarily, as you said, it was polydrug exposures, and I think there was today 2 cases where only mifegynan was detected. It's a little bit questionable if all of the analysis, if all of the drugs were actually tested for or not, but that aside, yes, it was huge doses usually that were taken. So we're not talking about users that were taking 3 to 5 grams per dose and maybe 3 times per day. It was really heavy kratom use, and usually then in combination with other drugs. So if mifegynan was causative or kratom was causative in these steps, is still, to my mind, very questionable. And I think we cannot tell because from most animal studies, questionable how that translates into the human. We didn't see acute toxicity. We can dose it quite highly in terms of kratom and mifegynan, and the animals do not die. They don't experience respiratory depression as we see with classical opioids. Now you see certain signs of opioid toxicity. Definitely, you see constipation. You see hypertension. So like you said, you definitely have to be careful because it is still acting on opioid receptors. So it is an opioid in that sense, but you don't see the respiratory depression that's associated with classical opioids. So you need to dose it quite high, and then it's likely that it is working in conjunction with other substances.
And for someone that doesn't know about the pharmacology of nitradin, why is it that it's so safe compared to something like morphine or heroin or fentanyl? What is it that, because we have this idea culturally with opioids that any kind of high toxicity pharmacological class that are associated with that, and you have this glaring exception that's being used throughout the country that is seemingly safer than probably acetaminophen. And why is that? Why so much safer?
So the hypothesis, or what we're currently proposing from the literature, and have been Andrew Krugel and Chris McCarty in our own institution, we have done some molecular studies and also in vitro and in vivo studies that seem to confirm that, is that these indole alkaloids, mifegynan and alike, are binding to opioid receptors, and they bind as partial agonists, so they do not activate all of the receptors that they bind to when we talk about the opioid receptors. In contrast to morphine, which is a full agonist, so it activates all of the opioid receptors that it binds to. And they also show what is called a biased signaling. So basically, once they activate the receptor, there are 2 pathways that are being activated. And what we always focus on when we talk about these G protein coupled receptors is the G protein pathway, which leads to CAMP, which is the second intracellular signaling pathway, which then leads to some intracellular changes that ultimately then can lead to protein expression of all of these things. But there's also a second pathway, which is the beta-arrestin 2 pathway. And this pathway seems to be associated with some of the negative effects, like respiratory depression, like more pronounced constipation, as well as some of the dependence development that is associated with it. Now, we haven't worked that out entirely, to be honest, because we obviously still see that kratom overall leads to, in high doses, to dependence. It can still cause constipation. There's some respiratory depression, but not as severe as we see with morphine and other classical opioids. So this kind of bias signaling might not apply to all of the alkaloids that are present in kratom, and we haven't worked that out entirely for all of them.
But is that not the case for 7-hydroxymetragine?
So 7-hydroxymetragine, and I go back between mifepristone and mifepristone, so I apologize sometimes. I get wrapped up in it. It actually shows although there's only this one hydroxyl that is added between the indole and in this complex structure, it actually shows it can replace morphine. It can provide the same response when you train a rat on morphine, make morphine dependent, so to say. It can replace morphine, whereas mifepristone cannot.
Rats out that are getting all high. I want to save, rescue one. And
So
keep it
there's
the same.
something with 7-hydroxy.
Be like, a rat, how people rescue dogs. How come nobody's out there and be like, this was a lab rat. He's had so much morphine tested on him. He sleeps all day. I want to go save one of those little bastards. They'd be the best.
It seems to prevent with the bias.
I feel so much better about having a rat
I
as
do
a
not
pet.
fully understand why that is the case. It seems to be related
He was a lab
potentially,
rat. Broke in and
receptor opioid receptor selectivity. So the difference in mu opioid versus kappa and delta opioid receptor.
This one's really cool. It's like a
And
lot
am I
like
correct in
squatter and
understanding
like
that
thicker.
7-hydroxymetragine is both naturally occurring in the
But
plant
it's
and
definitely like a
an
little
metabolite
different than all the other ones.
Correct, yes. So we're not exactly certain that it's actually naturally occurring. It might actually occur, and that's just a hypothesis. It's not completely sure if it happens, if it actually is occurring as a byproduct of the drying process. If it is actually in the fresh meat, if you just pick it and you chew it, as is done traditionally, and you get kind of this with stimulant burst, if that is actually, if 7-hydroxy is still in there, or if it's just a byproduct of the drying process. And then it is definitely a human metabolite, so it's generated through CYP enzymes. And we think that it has to do with much of the opioid analgesic effects, but it might also be another yet not fully understood process that is another oxindole metabolite of mifepristone that might also contribute to some of the pharmacological effects of kratom.
Do you know what that other metabolite is?
It just came out, the publication just came out.
Pseudoindoxyl?
It's a pseudoindoxyl, it's mifepristone pseudoindoxyl metabolite that is generated through esterases in the blood. So it's not generated through CYP enzymes. But it's not yet fully confirmed if that is stronger acting than mifepristone or 7-hydroxymifepristone. We're not yet certain.
Right. And I think that the issue of prodrugs and active metabolites is one of the most complicated aspects of opioid pharmacology because, there's a sort of, it's considered like a basic fact, at least in terms of what I've learned in pharmacology, that two drugs, all else equal, the drug that has the slower onset will have lower abuse potential than the one with faster onset, the one with the longer duration will have lower abuse potential than the one with the shorter duration. And so when you have a drug that has a primary active metabolite that seems like, in some sense, it's desirable because it's going to reduce the rapidity of the onset of the opioid action. And that is why I imagine why in many countries codeine can be sold over the counter, even though it's really just a morphine prodrug, and morphine is not over the counter anywhere on earth. And the same is true of tramadol, which wasn't even a controlled substance in the United States until, I don't know, 5 years ago or something like that, which is basically a prodrug for O-desmethyl tramadol. But there's a lot of people, experts on opioids, is a physician named David Gerling. I don't know if you're familiar with him, but he's kind of an interesting opioid pharmacologist physician, and he's very much against prodrug opioids because he thinks that they're then leaving the activation of the substance up to some genetically determined metabolic whim that would be completely different between users. Have you seen any evidence that people from different different parts of the world or different types of cytochrome enzymes metabolize the differently?
So we haven't seen that in humans yet, but we have seen in rat studies because we know the metabolic pathway of nitroguanine that CYP2D6 might actually be one of these candidates because we know about genomic differences in that expression, that there are fast metabolizers, ultra rapid metabolizers, and also slow metabolizers of CYP2D6.
First person to
that
message
isoforms,
me on Instagram gets a free chill.
that
You know
might
what I'm saying? Like, give me
metabolize
There's one
rapidly.
keep people
Uh,
paid.
on Facebook.
So
Alright,
that might
that
lead itself to
They message
different
me on Instagram.
effects
They get a free
that quantum can have. Now, we have to be aware, we only talk about nitroguanine, and nitroguanine might be the most
Is there some
abundant.
password they're supposed to say?
There's obviously more to quantum
They
than
message me.
nitroguanine.
free chill them
It's
for Facebook Live. I don't know. I'll figure it out. Deep letters.
We're on Facebook, Twitch, YouTube, Twitter.
Oh, damn. You're all over the place now.
Yeah, we're about to host it on our website too. So Facebook might, it's like the most censored, and it's also the least amount of viewers. Eventually, it might be off of Facebook altogether, but we might still post a link to another post site.
Because somebody will just have to be a problem solver and figure it out.
Oh, no, we can program all that shit there. That's how I'm live on like 5 platforms at once right now.
Yeah, which made me very curious to ask about one of the other outlets that you brought to my attention, email Dr. Grubman, which is Bright Widow 5, which, what I'm pronouncing that right. I saw a very short Wikipedia article for this that said it was a selective NMDA antagonist and partial calcium ion channel blocker.
Yeah.
What other research or knowledge you have on right? It's just amazing to me what all these my tragedy staff will